Recently, a friend of mine was telling me why she stopped going to church. I'm tired of people acting fake, she said. She was tired of everyone acting like things were all right, or responding to problems with the kind of uncaring attitude of people who were way too comfortable with the idea that someone else, higher than them, would come to save them. While she saw people giving reassurances like all things are in God's plan and God will make good of all things, she also saw people facing genuine problems. Hunger, stress, financial instability were all things that she saw both inside and outside the church. And she couldn't reconcile the words of churchgoers with the physical fact of people's struggles. She asked me if I saw that in my church. And I responded that I've seen that in every church. That kind of face-turning unrecognition of strife kind of happens everywhere. From churches to schools to government offices. And that's something that I want to touch on today. How do we, as God's people, reconcile the fact that people suffer, or that we're suffering, with our perspectives on a loving and omniscient God? And how are we supposed to act in the face of that very personal kind of suffering? How do we respond to our own suffering? Now, there's a book in the Bible that's all about suffering, the book of Lamentations. For those of you who don't know, the word lamentation means the expression of grief or sorrow. It's a pretty appropriate name for the book since the entire book is written about the pain of the Hebrew people after the fall of their city of Jerusalem. Let me set the stage. The Hebrew people have been in communion with God for centuries now, since the days of Abraham in Genesis. After freeing the Hebrew people from Pharaoh's rule in Egypt, God has been alongside them as they travel and build their own kingdoms, cities, and states. And throughout all this time, the Hebrew people have had this incredibly long back and forth between serving God and failing God. In fact, there is a long line of Hebrew kings and rulers who are well known for failing God and just not heeding his advice. So, the Hebrews find themselves in war after war, and their kingdoms fall or break apart one after another. Eventually, they find themselves under siege once again, and find that one of their most spiritually important cities, Jerusalem, is razed to the ground. This book is written in the aftermath of that. The writer mourns the loss of his city, his people, and his home. It is heavy and powerful in its grief. Can you imagine a moment of loss in your life? That overwhelming pain when you realize that something that you love is no longer there? For some of us, that might be the loss of a family member or beloved pet. For others, that might be the loss of a home or of your friends as you move somewhere different. And for even more, I'm sure you've never quite experienced loss like this. Regardless, we will all end up facing loss in our lives. Whether it is directly through something we lose ourselves and the pain that follows, or indirectly through the loss and pain of someone close to us. So, looking in Lamentations, how does that writer express their grief? And what does God do or say in response? Maybe that'll give us some insight into how we should be dealing with it. Now, here's the funny thing about Lamentations. In the 5 chapters that make up the relatively short book, God never makes a physical appearance. No voice in the sky, no bush on fire. In fact, from beginning to end, the book is made up of poems about the fall of Jerusalem and the pain of God's people. And God never shows up. Almost all of these poems follow a particular structure, with each verse starting with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, as it is in the original language. However, in the final chapter and poem of the book, this structure falls apart. I'd like to look at that poem today because it feels particularly relevant. In opening, it describes the many people who have been left in despair since Jerusalem fell, and its people have been captured. And as the poem closes, Lamentations, it ends on a really interesting note. For those who are following in their own Bibles, take a look at verses 19 and 22 with me. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Talk about a depressing passage. This closes the book of Lamentations with this odd kind of stilted plea to God. It praises God, says, "But you, O Lord, reign forever," but then it cries out to God. Why have you forgotten us completely? And here's the thing. In any other book of the Bible, God would have responded. God would say something along the lines of, "I have not forgotten you," or "You deserved your punishment." But in this passage, we don't get any of that. So where's God? This person is screaming out in pain, and God is silent. Looking at this passage, it's really easy to believe that God simply isn't there. But that feels wrong. God is supposed to be all loving, right? So God should be there. What is he doing? I think it would be a mistake to just so easily believe that God is not there in this moment. And I think that in knowing who God is, loving and caring, God must be doing something here that we end up overlooking, both in this passage and maybe in our own lives. In not speaking, God is listening. God doesn't offer the poet these pretty words or comfort. God recognizes that pain and doesn't try to mute the speaker's feelings. I think that's essential for us today. So often, when we or our loved ones face pain, we want to comfort them or lessen that emotion for them, but most of the time, what's most important is to recognize that pain and listen to it, give it space, just as God does. So, in response to this incredibly desperate plea, after God gives the poet time to cry, gives the Hebrew people time to grieve, he offers the solution. Jesus Christ comes centuries later, the ultimate beacon of hope. And the Hebrew people are relieved in finding salvation in him and his promise. Ultimately, I think that we need to remember this moment in the Bible. When there's pain and suffering, God is with us and hears us, listens. And when there's pain and suffering in the lives of others, maybe the most helpful thing we can offer is the same. Now, as we finish up here, the youth group will be getting together in our Zoom call. So follow the link somewhere down in the doobly-doo to get there. And while you're doing that, consider these few questions that we'll be touching on tonight. First of all, how do you respond to physical pain? Do you cry, grit your teeth, and ride it out? Or do you find some other way to respond? Secondly, how do you respond to emotional pain? Is it the same or perhaps different from how you respond to physical pain? And also, how do you how do you usually respond to other people's pain? Do you try and help? Maybe you try and offer solutions, or do you just listen? There are so many ways and so many different methods that we can respond. And lastly, this one's a bit more meditative and a bit more personal. But I want to ask that we all take a moment and just think on a time when we've felt loss or pain. Or if nothing comes to mind, a moment when you know someone, or a moment when someone you know has seen loss or pain in their lives. What was that like? How did that feel? And kind of delving into that memory, do you see God listening to you? I'll see you all in a few moments. Take care, y'all. Gotta keep my calm before the storm. I don't want less, I don't want more. Must bar the windows and the doors to keep me safe, to keep me warm. Yeah, my life is what I'm fighting for. Can't part the sea, can't reach the shore. And my voice becomes the driving force. I won't let this pull me overboard. God, keep my head above water, don't let me drown. It gets harder, I'll meet you there at the altar as I fall down on my knees. Don't let me drown, drown, drown. Don't let me drown. So pull me up from down below, 'cause I'm underneath the undertow. Come dry me off and hold me close. I need you now, I need you most. God, keep my head above water, don't let me drown. It gets harder, I'll meet you there at the altar as I fall down on my knees. Don't let me drown, drown, drown. Don't let me drown. Don't let me drown, drown, drown. Don't let me